Sam Seder on the Majority Report on the phone. It is a pleasure to welcome to the program Mark Weisbrot. He is an economist and columnist, co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington, D.C. His latest is in The Nation magazine, The Trump Administration Undercutting Democracy in Bolivia. The subtitle, Will the U.S. and the Organization of American States Once Again Be Able to Overturn Election Results? Mark, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
So, all right, now, Mark, there's a lot of controversy over how to characterize what took place in Bolivia over the past couple of days. Let's go back and sort of provide everybody with sort of a timeline as to what's been going on, because I started the show by saying this, that we've been characterizing it as a coup. One of my, I guess, maxims is when the military personnel have to wear baklavas when they go on TV, bringing out election officials. That's a good sign that this is not a democratic process. But I've had some pushback from listeners who are Bolivian or have family or relatives in Bolivia. But let's start with just sort of give us the timeline of what has taken place with Evo Morales.
Yes, in terms of the coup, it's kind of funny. I was talking to one of the major broadcast TV stations in the U.S. I won't say which one, yesterday. And she said she talked to two people who said it wasn't a coup. I said, well, you don't really have to bother with those people because, this was a coup. The president, the head of the armed forces told the president and vice president to resign. And then they did. I said, what did they have to do? Stick a gun in his face? This was a military coup, and there isn't any doubt about it at all. And in terms of
do we know that they didn't? Frankly,
I think we probably would have heard that if they actually pointed the gun at them, but they didn't have to. There's so many ways they can kill them or just let a mob kill them if they wanted to. There's been right-wing violence in that country. The right-wing tried to overthrow the government in 2009 violently. And so, they told to leave. And Evo is now reportedly on his way to Mexico, where he's been offered asylum. So the headline on that Nation article was kind of an understatement. It's all done now. And Trump has now the White House issued a statement yesterday supporting the coup and saying that it was bringing democracy to, it was a very Orwellian statement, saying it's bringing democracy. But you want a timeline from the election, October 20th?
Well, let's even go before then, because part of the argument that this is not a coup was because people have perceived Morales as undemocratically becoming president for the fourth time, I guess. And so just walk us back from the beginning of Morales's ascent.
Okay, well, he was elected in 2005. And how much time do we have?
We got plenty of time.
Oh, okay, great. All right, well, he was elected in 2005 and took office in 2006. And I went down there actually in 2005, and it was very interesting because I met with him and his ministers. And first thing I asked the ministers is, what's going to happen? You've been under IMF agreements for 20 straight years now. And what's going to happen now? And he said, oh, well, the IMF was here. They offered us a new standby arrangement, and we said no. And they offered us a poverty reduction growth facility loan, and we said no. And when I said, and we said, no, thanks, we don't need it. I said, well, what about all your other aid that you get? They got grants from Europe because they're the poorest country in South America. And he said, well, they said that wouldn't be dependent on that anymore. So they really made a major break. And for those, at that moment when I was talking to them, that economy, the income per person in that economy, when Evo took office, this is the most basic measure that economists have of economic well-being, is just income per person. not even looking at distribution, okay? And it had not grown for 27 years, 20 of those under the IMF agreement. So this was a major break, okay? That's the first thing. And then they've done very well since then. They've been the fastest growing, they've grown twice as fast as Latin America since 2000, in terms of income per person, since 2006, since Evo took office. They reduced poverty by 42% and extreme poverty by 60%. And these are all official numbers that are accepted by, the IMF, the World Bank, the UN. These are not just, somebody's numbers, okay? So this is why he's popular still and was able to get 47% of the vote, even with, almost all the media against him.
All right. Well, I want to go through the changes in the Constitution that, in some respects, he pushed through. I mean, my understanding is that the controversy surrounding him was that he entered into office. He did not serve a full term the first time around because of when the election was held. He then served for two more consecutive terms. At that time, the Constitution said that 2 was the limit. There was a referendum. I mean, this is just the history as I know it. You tell me if I'm wrong.
Yeah,
There was a referendum that narrowly defeated an amendment to the Constitution to change that. He went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court of Bolivia found that the term limits was unconstitutional, sort of ignoring or overturning the referendum, as it were, and opening the door for him to run for re-election. Then that takes us up to this election that he wins, as you say, 47 to 37% or so.
36.5.
36.5. If you have less than 40%, there needs to be a runoff. He avoided a runoff. There was a...
No, the rule, okay, there's two rules for the avoiding the runoff. One is if you get a majority outright, over 50, then you don't have a runoff. The second is if you get over 40% and you beat the second runner-up by more than 10 percentage points, then there's no runoff. Okay. So he made that with 10.6.
Okay, and so we also now have the OAS, the Organization of American States, came out with an initial report saying that there were voting irregularities. And this is what your piece discusses. Give us your assessment of their assessment.
Okay. I want to put a little more detail, but before, I just want to mention one other thing that I should have mentioned from the beginning, is that Evo Morales is the first indigenous president in the country, and really, pretty much in the whole Latin America for 500 years. But it's particular in Bolivia because it has the largest indigenous percentage of the population in the Americas. And this is a big thing because, indigenous people were very much marginalized and excluded, and they made a disproportionate amount of progress that I described in terms of the economic progress that the country has made since he took office. But, okay, so back to the election and the OAS. So the OAS put out a press statement right after the election, the day after, and it said, and I'm going to have to go into some detail here because,
please,
most of your listeners think, if they're reading the press, they think this election was stolen. That's the impression you get from the media, even though most of the media doesn't say that outright. Okay, so the OAS puts out a press release right after the election, and they state their, quote, deep concern and surprise at the drastic and hard to explain change in the trend of the preliminary results that were being reported. Okay, so this one sentence, which they repeated two more times in their preliminary report, and then something like it in their latest audit, the preliminary audit that they just did, which AVO invited them in the country to do. This is the Organization of States Electoral Observation Mission. And they're supposed to be professionals, and they're supposed to do a clean observation, and they're never, ever supposed to put out a press release right after the election implying, as they did, that there's something wrong with the vote count when they do not have one shred of evidence for that. That's
in other words,
one.
they just hadn't done the analysis. It was more
They
of
hadn't
like,
done any analysis whatsoever, and they said this. Now, let's take a look at what they were talking about, because we did the statistical analysis. And, you know, if you look at the press, it's very interesting. Like, there's all these articles, you know, they're all over the press that have the same theme. And the theme is that there was this vote count that was being reported, and then all of a sudden the vote count stopped after 84%. This is what they're talking about here in that one sentence. It stopped after at 84% of the votes tallied. And then it came back, and AVO's margin increased. And it increased enough that when 95% of the votes were reported, he was just over the 10% margin. Now, this is the fundamental basis of the entire getting rid of him, because they're all yelling about fraud in the streets. You have the New York Times even saying this, you know, although they had an article just 2 days ago where they had to remove 2 false statements from the article, and they didn't put a correction there, but they had 2 false statements about exactly this. Okay, so all the media is getting this wrong, and I don't do media criticism. Okay, so I'm not going to trash anybody for how bad this report is, because, you know, the reporters don't have time to look at numbers, and they think the OAS is a reliable source, and that's probably because they don't know the history of its, you know, electoral observation in this hemisphere. But nonetheless, they just took their word for this. They're expressing concern, and it kind of looks funny, right? He's only got 7 points, and he needs 10, and then he gets 10 after this interruption. Now let's see what really happened, okay? What really happened is this count that they're referring to, and it's the only count they refer to in the media, is not the official vote count. It's called a quick count. It's something that's done only, and it was actually originally instituted, I think, at the request of the OAS. It's something that's done to keep people informed of what's going on with the count before the official count can be done, because that takes longer, okay? It's just they take basically screenshots of the results at intervals and they post them. Now, this count is not the official count. It's not binding. It's not doesn't have the same rules. It doesn't determine the result of the election. And it's the only vote count you'll see discussed in the media, because I think most of the reporters don't even know this, you know. And so this count, sorry to go into detail of it,
no,
but this count was never promised to go to 100%. And it never did in the past elections. It stopped around 70, okay? So they stopped at 84% because, you know, they were done. And there was nothing really that surprising about it. And the OAS observation mission knows this. And here's the most important thing. There's literally no concern or surprise that anybody who can do 8th grade arithmetic and read a graph, let alone a statistical analysis, should express at the fact that AVO's margin increased exactly as much as it did. Why? Because it wasn't a jump, as it looks like to you in the media. It wasn't a jump from the 84%, from the first 84% to the count at 95% of the votes. It was a continuation of a gradual trend that was going on almost the whole time. And what was the cause of this gradual trend? It's completely visible in the data to anyone who looks at it, and it's all on the web. 34,000 data points from all the tally sheets, okay? And if you look at the data, what you see is that Evo, what we all knew, Evo gets much more support from areas that are rural and poor.
Right.
And those come in later. And they were coming in later the whole time.
That dynamic, it's frankly not too dissimilar from ones that we have in this country.
Oh, of course. How many times have you watched an election result?
Well, Kashima Swant, let's just say as one, or Chesa Boudin, the count of those who had, I guess, mailed in their ballots tends to run more progressive. Those get counted later. That's why the rate of the votes that they pick up, and there's a similar dynamic with rural counties in this country, where you hear stuff from New Hampshire coming from the remote parts, or wherever it is. I mean, this is not an unheard of dynamic.
Nobody denies this. Okay. Nobody denies this. We've had our report out. I just tweeted out all this stuff that I'm talking about, and it was, it went out to 4,600 retweets, and it's all over the place. And, all of these reporters have seen it. Like I said, the New York Times ran 2 corrections already. They all know this. Nobody's reported it. And I think that is kind of disgraceful, because they have people at the New York Times. They have Nate Silver. They can go to anybody in their own.
Cohn, to be fair. You got the wrong Nate, but yes.
Oh yeah, they have Nate Cohn, but that's right. They don't have Nate Silver anymore. They used to.
All right, that's true. Right. But so Mark, let me ask you this. So I'm looking at a report from the OAS right now. This is the Secretariat for Strengthening Democracy, the Department of Electoral Cooperation Observation. It's the Electoral Integrity Analysis, General Elections of the Plurinational State of Bolivia, October 20th, 2019, preliminary findings. Is what you've just discussed to us, is that what I'm looking at in this report? Because it has the electoral results transmission system in the preliminary findings. It has...
How long is this one? Because there's 2 that they put out.
This one here is the 13-page one.
Yeah, it's called preliminary report.
Yeah, and this one it's a 13-1. It gives an
Actually, if it's in English, it has to be the preliminary report, because they haven't come out with the audit report in English yet. Yeah, I read that. Yeah.
Well, okay. So with all this said, there's these questions now. Morales. Then there was massive protests in Bolivia.
Yeah.
Right. We had hundreds of thousands, if not over 1 million people, come out and protest, in my understanding.
Yeah, its country is polarized. As I said, they tried to overthrow the government in 2009 with the right wing. Yeah.
Morales agrees to a revote. Is that right?
He did do that because, and this, you could say it was a mistake for him to invite the OAS to do this audit after they had already lied twice about this, but he did it. And he said, when he invited them to do this last audit, that if they found anything wrong, that he would have a new election. And so he kept his promise. But the right, of course, the opposition, they weren't going for a new election anymore. They wanted a coup. And so they didn't care that he was willing to have a new election. They wanted him out. And, the rule of law, who cares, right? I mean, he's still the only legitimate president, because no matter what you think of this election, you can think that it was a total farce, whatever you want to say. And again, there hasn't been any evidence yet of any stealing or vote fraud. But, even if you don't believe it at all, he's still the president until December or something. And because he was democratically elected, and there's no new president. And
in other words, his existing term does not end until December.
That's right. December 22nd, I think. And so he is the president of the country, and the military ran him out of the country. So this is a classic military coup, and the reluctance of so much of the media to even call it that, but even worse, the endorsement of it by the president of the United States. I mean, even when George W. Bush had the CIA overthrow the president of Haiti in 1991, he denounced the coup,
right?
Because and he put sanctions on the dictatorship that they had actually paid people to install. So because it just wasn't acceptable to support a military coup against a democratically elected government. So we've descended a little bit since then.
Right.
In terms of what the media is willing to tolerate, especially.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, these are these are the most. Regardless, you could stipulate that the election was corrupted. He agreed to have another election. You could stipulate that he forced the the Supreme Court to rule in his favor by.
Well, he didn't though. They just ruled.
Of course.
I mean, that's like saying Bush v. Gore was forced by the Republicans. You can disagree with the decision, and I have a different view of term limits than a lot of the media. So we can talk about that if you want to. On the substance, I don't really believe in term limits. You don't have them. Angela Merkel has been in office longer than Evo, and they seem to think it's okay for European countries, but not for developing countries. Which obviously there's a certain amount of racism here, but
but either way, the bottom line is the guy was president under any circumstance until December, and the military's come in wearing ski masks and have said you got to leave. That is just not a democratic process. There's no way one could argue that this has been
I hate
a democratic
to say
process.
This because I really don't like to do media criticism, but the New York Times has an editorial. Which is the first one in 17 years like this that endorses the coup.
Is this really their first time that they've endorsed a coup? Because it feels like it's not.
It's the first one in 17 years, and the last one they did it was in 2002, and they walked back from it. It was on a Friday, and they walked back from it on the following Tuesday because they realized it was real, and they said it was wrong.
So let's talk a little bit about the potential reasons why we are getting, and like I say, right? I've gotten emails from people who say, my wife and I live we're in Singapore, but somehow she voted for Evo at her polling location in La Paz. My old coworker's dead father. Now, I don't know who this is from. I don't know if it's true, but I'm going to stipulate all of these things. The bottom line is the guy's term doesn't end till December. We can't, if Donald Trump, God willing, loses the election in November of 2020, we can't have the military come in and remove him from office and say that this is part of the democratic process. I mean, this is fairly straightforward stuff, it seems to me.
It should be, yeah. I think it's really terrible.
So let's talk about the reasons why this might happen. I mean, some of the things that have been suggested to me is one of the things is, I mean, on top of the fact that we have a history, the DEA, as early as, this is according to a piece in the HuffPo by Ryan Grimm and Nick Wing from some time ago. I don't have the exact date with me, but this, according to them, in 2008, after the Morales expelled the DEA from Bolivia, they started their own strategy of beginning to target Morales in a drug sting at the time. So there's been a history of U.S. government attempts to get rid of Morales. Obviously, the U.S. government's attempt to get rid of Latin American leaders is longer than I've been alive, and so. But with that said, my understanding is recently Morales made a move to nationalize the lithium mining business. And of course, lithium, rather important for batteries and all of our technologies. What else? What other interests?
Well, this is something I've been writing about for 20 years, so I can talk about this as long as you want. I mean,
please.
In the 21st century, there was a major change in Latin America. For the first time, I think, and other people have said this, in 500 years, it became independent. You had very independent left governments were elected that governed over the majority of the people in Latin America, in Argentina and Brazil and Venezuela and Bolivia, Ecuador, Uruguay, Paraguay, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Honduras. So this was really a new and different thing. They couldn't really do this in the past for exactly the reasons that we're seeing right now. When they tried, in fact, a lot of these people didn't want to run for office because they were still looking at they didn't think it was possible. The last time they elected a left president in 1973, for example, in 1970 in Chile, he was overthrown with the help of the United States. And so they didn't, but then once people started doing it and people realized they could vote and actually elect a president, they would stay there. And, there was enormous progress during this period, by the way, from 2003 to 2013. You had poverty fell from, the poverty rate in Latin America fell from 44 to 28% after having risen for the prior 20 years, actually haven't gone up. So you had a huge economic failure from 1980 to 2000, and that produced this wave of left governments. And, I don't want to oversimplify, but I would say it's not really an exaggeration to say that the U.S. policy under both the Bush and Obama administrations was a policy of containment and rollback. And they got rid of whatever governments they could. They did that coup in Honduras. I mean, they supported the coup in Honduras in 2009. Hillary Clinton wrote in her memoirs that as Secretary of State, she actually worked, and she worked within the OAS too, to make sure that the democratically elected president could not come back to the country. And so, and I could go through all of these countries. In almost every one of these countries, the United States has done something to harm or undermine, or in a few cases, get rid of these democratically elected governments. All the time you want, we can pick a country.
Right.
I'll tell you what they did.
Well, I mean, I think folks are at least a little bit well versed on that history around these parts. But in terms of the OAS, give us an example of why we should. I mean, obviously, the preliminary results are preliminary, and they, one piece of evidence that they may have been predisposed to finding a specific, answer in regard to these elections. And I should say, again, even if we stipulate that the OAS was correct in finding irregularities, we've already heard they're there under the auspices of Morales to a certain extent. He allowed them in. He welcomed them in. He has agreed to a re-election to run this again. And so, I mean, in some respects, it's sort of moot whatever they found or what their predispositions are, but we've seen evidence of their predispositions. What other examples do you have of the OAS looking at voting an election and claiming irregularities when it turns out there were, and look, there's irregularities, I would imagine, in every election. I certainly think there is in this country.
Yes.
But
yes,
I mean, ones that
worse.
Are material enough to change the outcome. What can you point us to for folks who want to dig a little deeper into this?
Yes. Well, first of all, if anybody wants to just go to my Twitter feed, the pinned tweet at the top has all of the work we've done on recently on Bolivia, including the elections. And we did a statistical analysis of this latest election, even though as I said, the quick count is not the official count. It's the one that the media is using. So it was very easy statistically to show that you could predict the last 16% of votes that were reported, or last 11% in the quick count, but either one. The remaining votes, you could predict them on the basis of the 84% of votes that came before the interruption, because it was the same trend. So it's a simple statistical analysis. So So what is the main question here?
Well, the main question was just sort of where else do we see an example of the OAS coming in?
Oh, yes. Okay, I did write about that, and there are links in the Nation article. But the two that we investigated, and especially the last one, where we did statistical analysis, was the 2011 Haitian election, where the OAS did something that electoral observers never do. They came in, they set up a commission within the OAS to look at this election, the first round of the presidential election in Haiti, which took place in 2010, and the report was issued in 2011. And they looked at it, and they were to make some recommendation, and they overturned the result of the election without any statistical analysis or a recount. And it was completely political. In fact, I was on a panel with the head statistician. He was a former head of the American Statistical Association, and he admitted straight out that it was a political decision. And so that was outrageous. And the U.S. government actually pressured Haiti, threatening to withhold desperately needed post-earthquake aid. Remember the earthquake in 2010 that devastated the country, unless they accepted what the OAS decided for their election. Now, that didn't destroy the country as badly as what they did in 2000. In 2000, there was an election, and President Aristide, who was the one that was overthrown in 1991, was running, and he won by a large majority with a very large turnout. And they couldn't, and then the OAS initially issued a report saying the election was good, was very good. And then they got the word, apparently, because then they changed that, and they complained, and they couldn't complain about the presidential part of it because it was too big of a margin. So they went for these Senate races, and they discredited the election on that basis. And that became the theme in every media article, not just then, but for the next 4 years. This was the dispute between the government and the opposition of Haiti, was the results of the parliamentary part, the Senate part of this election. And this was reported in the media the way I'm talking about right now, in Bolivia. They really made it look like the government stole something. And this was used to cut off all international aid to Haiti during this, almost all, really virtually all, because it was all U.S. allies, France and Canada. They were all in it. They all wanted to get rid of this president. And because they already gotten rid of him in 91, he wasn't supposed to come back. And so they did this, and they really starved the country and made a mess out of it. And then in 2004, they had a coup, which was, of course, supported by the United States. And a plane, according to Aristide and witnesses, that was a U.S. plane, one of those rendition planes actually, took him out of the country to Africa. And he was in exile for 7 years. And so that was really, I have to blame the OAS a lot for that, because if they hadn't changed their report, the U.S. would not have been able to have at least that major pretext for delegitimizing the government and working towards this coup for 4 years. And this is there's a lot of actual record on this. So it isn't, speculation.
Right.
For example, there was a very good article in the New York Times that showed from U.S. Government sources, officials, that at the same time when the president of Haiti was having this fight with the opposition over the elections, and he was trying to negotiate with it. He was willing to, make compromises, and they were telling the opposition not to give in, that not to make any agreement with him, that we're going to get rid of this government. So, and that's how the coup happened. And that country has been politically destroyed since then. And that was really, so I think those were two very serious offenses by the OAS. And I think if some of the journalists knew this history, they wouldn't just take the OAS statements as the word of God, especially with Trump and Rubio openly supporting this coup and leaning on the OAS to do what they want.
Well, Mark Weisbrot, we appreciate your time today. I mean, I think at the very least, the idea that this has been a democratic response to something that people say is anti-democratic is laughable, and the reporting on this has been, I think, pretty atrocious, because there's no doubt in my mind that people who have been following this, at least to some extent, have far more information than they did. I really appreciate your time today. And we will put a link to that piece in the Nation magazine at majority.fm. Thanks again for your time.
Thanks very much.